In a world of magic, a boy named Hart reincarnates with extraordinary powers. However, his parents abandon him, thinking he is different. Therefore, despite the dangers, Hart must find his own way. The anime begins with our protagonist, also named Hart, who reveals that he stopped attending school 5 years ago due to intense bullying from his classmates. Now, he lives in his room without hope or a future. While playing on his phone, a glow fills the room, and he is taken to the sky where he meets a goddess. She explains that he will be reincarnated, and he realizes that he has died. The goddess informs him that she will grant him powers to live in a world where magic is everything. Thinking he can live a peaceful life watching anime and playing video games with these powers, Hart agrees. The goddess transports him to his new life, and Hart wakes up as a baby. He soon realizes his father is a king, who notices a mark on his chest and claims it signifies royalty. The king celebrates with his much younger wife and orders a magic test for Hart. One of the servants raises a magic sphere to measure Hart's magic. The king hopes for a power level above 50, but the sphere indicates Hart's magic is only 2, with no elemental affinity. Disappointed, the king and his wife declare it a disgrace and decide to announce Hart's death during childbirth. They order servants to take him to a forest and abandon him there. Witnessing this, the goddess feels uneasy and tells a companion that Hart's power is much higher, but the world's devices can't measure it accurately. She reveals she granted him 1002 power. In the forest, Hart tries to use magic to protect himself. He creates a cube as a shield when a giant wolf appears. The wolf attempts to bite him but fails due to the cube. Hart creates more cubes and hits the wolf, but it remains unharmed. Resorting to throwing trees at the wolf, Hart injures it, but it stands back up. The wolf admits defeat when Hart picks up a giant rock. Hart realizes the wolf is actually a she-wolf named Flay, who intended to eat him to regain her mana. Flay acknowledges Hart's strength and asks if he is the reincarnation of the Dark Lord, and Hart, to avoid further attacks, confirms it. Flay then offers to serve him as gratitude for sparing her life. Hart, realizing he can't communicate as a baby, uses magic to speak. He explains his royal lineage and abandonment due to perceived weakness. Flay disputes this, recognizing his immense mana. Hart lies about being the Dark Lord's reincarnation to prevent another attack. Flay prostrates herself, asking Hart to kill her, but he refuses and decides to leave. Flay stops him, offering to serve him for sparing her life. Hart faints, stating he needs breast milk. Flay transforms into a human, surprising Hart, who requests she dresses. Instead, she undresses and asks for his seed to produce milk through a sexual encounter. Later, Flay apologizes to Hart, who hears a knight approaching. Hart prepares to attack, but Gold, the knight, tells Flay to take Hart. Flay claims Hart belongs to her due to a pact. Gold reveals he brought breast milk and explains his desire to raise Hart after losing his own child. Flay tearfully accepts, and Hart continues living with Gold's family. 9 years later, Hart lives with Gold and his family. Hart's sister, Charlotte, dislikes him, and during breakfast, she asks Flay to play with her. Flay declines, saying she must care for Hart, but Gold orders her to play with Charlotte. Gold's wife approaches Hart, explaining that Charlotte struggles with kids her age and encourages him to do something special to win her affection. Hart contemplates leaving, as staying may complicate things. He reveals he created a robot to replace him when he's gone, but realizes he'd also need a robot for Flay. Gold takes him to the yard, promising to teach him sword fighting. Hart expresses more interest in ancient magic, but Gold gives him a wooden sword for training. After causing a hole in the ground, Hart realizes he's felt different lately, despite his magic remaining at level 2. Gold criticizes Hart's novice moves after training, promising to continue teaching him. In the night, Gold tells his wife that Hart might be a returned demon, as his royal family has ancestors with connections to demons. However, his wife refuses to believe it, and Gold assures her that they will take care of Hart no matter what. A few days later, Hart hears a commotion outside the castle. He leaves his room and approaches Gold, who informs him that he and his soldiers were ambushed by a band of thieves. Gold asks Hart to return to his room to avoid seeing the injured. Hart obeys and goes back with Flay, using his healing magic to heal the soldiers, who are surprised to see their wounds disappear. Later that night, Hart wakes up to go outside and encounters Flay, who apologizes for speaking ill of Gold. Hart forgives her and asks her to accompany him. Outside the castle, Hart uses his magic to locate the thieves who attacked Gold. He heads towards them with Flay, while Charlotte watches from the window. Upon reaching the thieves' fortress, Hart confronts the leader and two companions. He immobilizes them and throws one against the wall, stating they must answer his questions. One of them reveals they are soldiers from another kingdom pretending to be thieves to cause trouble in Gold's kingdom. Flay mentions the border guards should have prevented their entry, but the leader reveals they have an accomplice helping them, though they don't know more. Hart thanks them and asks Flay to set the fortress on fire, causing the other thieves to flee. The next day, Gold receives a letter stating the fortress was destroyed by fire, and the thieves escaped because of it. Gold orders an investigation to find out why the border guards let the thieves through. Charlotte asks who destroyed the fortress, and Gold speculates it was likely Flay, as she has more power than him. Later, Charlotte informs Flay that she saw someone resembling Hart flying with her at night. She checked Hart's room and found him sleeping, but uncertain if it was him due to the lack of power perception. Flay advises Charlotte not to worry about such things if she wants to grow. Later, Flay tells Hart about the incident, so he sets up surveillance to keep an eye on Charlotte. One night, Hart gets up to use the bathroom, and Charlotte begins to follow him. When he confronts her, she runs away. The next day, while taking a shower, Hart notices Charlotte watching him. Thus, Charlotte continues to watch Hart all day. During dinner, Gold informs them that Natalia and Charlotte will go on a trip to attend a festival. Hart suggests they take Flay, but he remembers she is busy controlling monsters to prevent them from attacking the castle. The next day, Hart wakes up to Charlotte's alarm, realizing she and her mother are being attacked. Meanwhile, guards try to defend them, but Empire soldiers kill them and start chasing Natalia and Charlotte. Hart uses his magic to guide Charlotte, who directs her mother where to run. Reaching a cliff, Charlotte tells her mother they must jump, and she does, using her mana to soften the fall. Finally, Charlotte points out a cave to hide in. After entering, Natalia leaves to find the person guiding her. However, the Empire soldiers find her, so she takes out her knife to cut her throat to avoid being kidnapped. Just then, Hart appears and stops her, causing her to faint. He gets angry, throws the soldiers into the trees, and takes Natalia to the cave, where Charlotte realizes his power. She approaches him and asks if he is a hero, and he confirms it. Charlotte apologizes for treating him poorly and promises to keep his secret. Back at the castle, the butler informs Gold that Natalia and Charlotte are safe. Gold wonders who saved them. Later, they arrive, and Charlotte hugs Hart, surprising her parents and making Flay jealous. Days pass, and Charlotte enters Hart's room to play with him, admitting that she hasn't left him alone since he saved them. She mentions studying ancient magic and recommends the castle's library for more information. Therefore, they go there, and Charlotte selects the best books, handing them to Hart, who immediately starts reading. Later, Charlotte sits on his lap and asks him to read aloud. Hart expresses his desire to watch anime, and when Charlotte asks what that is, he indulges her, sharing every detail. Charlotte expresses her desire to watch it too, as seeing him excited makes her happy as well. 2 weeks later, Hart creates an internet connection to show Charlotte anime. She is speechless to see the drawings move and talk. However, she mentions not understanding them as she doesn't speak Japanese. Hart teaches her, and within 2 hours, Charlotte learns to navigate the internet. 2 weeks after that, Charlotte asks Hart to let her watch a zombie series she loves. He grants permission but realizes he must control her TV time to prevent harm. After finishing an episode, he tells her she can only watch anime for 3 hours a day. Later, while they are having dinner, Gold asks both of them what they do when they are together. Charlotte responds that they study ancient magic. Later that night, Charlotte tries to follow Hart, but he sends her to bed. The next day, Charlotte enters the bathroom with Hart and discovers a mark on his chest. She thinks it's a hero's mark, and Hart goes along with it, claiming he uses it to hide his identity. Later, she lies in his bed, and Natalia watches them, stating that she feels happy to see them so close. The next morning, Gold bids farewell to his family to go fight the remaining thieves. Therefore, Charlotte asks Hart to fight against the thieves to maintain peace. He complies, transforms to avoid being recognized, and gives Charlotte a magical screen to watch him in action. Subsequently, Hart finds the thieves, imprisons them, and approaches, introducing himself as the vigilante. He gets so excited that he ends up beating them all. Later, Gold and his soldiers arrive, and Hart tells them his goal is to dispense justice. With that, he decides to leave while Gold wonders about his identity. Upon returning to the castle, Charlotte tells him he was great, and encourages him to keep fighting. As a result, Hart indulges her, spending the following months confronting the thieves until he becomes known as the Black Knight. Over time, Hart turns 10 and manages to program his robot clone to replace him. Charlotte discovers it but doesn't pay much attention. Later, Prince Laius and his sister Marion visit Gold's castle, where they are welcomed. Hart realizes they are his siblings but frowns at Laius for behaving rudely with his sister. Consequently, Laius challenges him to a sword fight. Ready for the duel, Laius attacks, but Hart quickly dodges. Laius complains and tells him to stop dodging. Therefore, Hart allows himself to be hit until Laius asks why he doesn't counterattack. Then, Hart starts hitting him repeatedly, worrying Marion, who doubts his power is really 2. Next, Laius gets angry and throws a fireball. Seeing this, Hart creates a shield and absorbs the magic. However, Laius continues throwing fireballs until Marion tells him to stop. Finally, Hart shows him that he has created a huge fireball himself. Later, Hart wonders if his biological parents are watching him, as apparently, everyone in the capital knows his power is 2. After a few weeks, Charlotte takes charge of surveillance. She sees some thieves, informs Hart, and Flay expresses a desire to help. However, he refuses, but Charlotte suggests it's a good idea as they would make the best duo. Therefore, Hart explains to Flay that if she accompanies him, she must not use explicit violence as Charlotte will be watching. At night, Hart appears to the thieves with Flay, who starts attacking them with fire. Hart then shields the thieves so they won't burn to death. Subsequently, he orders Flay to stop and leave so he can finish. Back at the castle, Charlotte congratulates both of them and teaches Flay new superhero poses, while Hart tries to wrest from both of them. On the other hand, Laius complains about losing to Hart. At that moment, his butler enters his room and tells him to choose Charlotte as his companion for the next visit. Meanwhile, Hart enjoys a grand feast, while his clone complains to him, stating that he is tired of doing all the things he doesn't like. Later, Charlotte tells him she will accompany Laius on the visit. At night, Hart checks that the route for the visit is in good condition. Thus, he discovers a group of men trying to perform a ritual and decides to approach them. While there, they attack him upon learning he is Gold's friend. After defeating them, one of them summons skeletal soldiers who rush toward Hart. Subsequently, he hits them with his sword, but they reassemble their bones to attack him again. However, Hart creates a shield and keeps them away. Then, he realizes that the gem in their chests controls them. He uses his magic to control them and orders them to attack the men. Seeing this, one of them summons a golem, which defeats the skeletons and attacks Hart. After receiving a blow, Hart looks for its weakness. Then, he realizes that it also has a gem in its chest, so he takes a stake and embeds it in the gem, modifying its magic. As a result, the golem attacks the men, who are surprised to learn that Hart has modified the gem. Finally, the skeletons tie up the men, and Hart asks the captain why they were there. However, he doesn't answer. Therefore, Hart orders the skeletons to bury the other men alive. Seeing this, the captain decides to talk and tells Hart that they are part of the summoning unit of the Queen Consort, who is Hart's biological mother. Furthermore, the captain explains that Consort wants to eliminate Charlotte, as she will surpass her in power, fearing that Gold will support her, creating a division in the kingdom. Angry upon hearing this, Hart begins to hurt the captain, controlling the golem. However, he stops and starts thinking about what he will do to Consort. The next day, Charlotte and Hart accompany Laius and Marion on the visit. During this, she begins telling Laius not to feel bad for losing to Hart. He attempts to change the subject, but Laius mentions he shouldn't pity him. Furthermore, he starts saying that Hart is probably a returned demon. However, Marion states it can't be since he has no tail, and his eyes are normal. Next, Charlotte asserts that his skin is also normal since they bathe together. This worries Marion, who tells her it's not right because when a man and a woman undress, it has a different meaning. Later, they reach the destination of the visit, finding a field full of wheat. Therefore, Charlotte invites Marion to run through it. As a result, she and Laius join her while Hart decides to talk to his father. He then asks what he would do if Consort wanted to kill Charlotte. Gold tells him he received a letter from the Dark Knight showing that Consort wants to eliminate them all. However, he explains he can't do anything against her since she is the queen, and without her reign, things would get worse in the kingdom. He also reveals that 2 years before Hart's birth, the king gathered an army to kill the Dark Lord, where Consort was included. As a result, she cut off the Dark Lord's head herself and returned to the kingdom as a heroine. After that, she married the king and has since tried to take over the kingdom. Hearing this, Hart realizes Consort has a lot of influence. Finally, Gold explains the need to have someone else who can take care of the throne. Therefore, Hart thinks Charlotte is the right one, so he promises his father to fulfill his duty, intending to take care of Charlotte until she is old enough to relieve himself of responsibility and live his life in peace without leaving his room. Later, Flay tells Hart that she wants to avenge him and cut Consort's head. However, he replies that he will do it himself and will take care of Charlotte. The next day, Consort's guards inform her that the Dark Knight has defeated all the thieves at the border and also eliminated the summoning unit. This annoys her, and she throws wine on the guards, taking her sword, claiming she will defeat the Dark Knight herself. Just then, Hart arrives and knocks out the guards. He then introduces himself to Consort, who creates 3 seals to attack him. Firstly, she encases him in a water prison to drown him, but Hart frees himself easily. Then, she throws a group of knives to hurt him, and he shields himself by creating a shield. Finally, Consort uses her fire flames to burn him, but she realizes Hart suffers no damage. He then attacks her quickly. Afterward, Consort defends herself, but Hart continues shooting at her until she decides to use her sword. They engage in close combat until Consort puts Hart on the ground, claiming she is the strongest in the world. Saying this, Hart takes away her sword and puts a collar on her. Additionally, he threatens her, stating she must stay away from Gold and his family if she doesn't want to lose her head. Subsequently, Consort realizes that from that day forward, she will be his slave. 5 years later, Charlotte enjoys a beautiful snowfall accompanied by Hart and Flay. After this, Hart mentions that Consort hasn't bothered them since the last time. Subsequently, Flay builds a snow castle that impresses Hart, who notices it's very cold, so he gives her winter clothes. Later, Charlotte approaches him and tells him she has created a snow attack. Therefore, he listens and performs the attack, creating a large hole in the ground. Then, Gold and Natalia arrive and are surprised to see the hole. So, Hart blames the Dark Knight. Consequently, Gold comments that Consort hasn't appeared in public due to a collar around her neck. However, he adds that he is happy to have peace. Upon hearing this, Hart tries to go to his room to be alone. But then, Gold tells him that in spring, they will send him to the capital school. This disappoints him as he claims to hate school. Later, Gold explains to Hart that the king sent him a letter asking him to attend school. Additionally, he explains that it is probably all Marion's fault since she seemed very interested in him during the visit. However, he is not very convinced when he sees that the school is elite. Then, Gold tells him that Laius will also go, so he should try to be friends with him. Finally, he mentions that as a father, he wants him to attend to meet more people and gain knowledge. With that, Hart decides to accept. Therefore, Gold advises him to take an assistant with him, and he starts thinking about who it could be until Natalia appears and offers to accompany him. However, he rejects her, stating it's not a good idea. In his room, Hart talks to his clone and asks him to go to school for him. He refuses, stating he can't use magic. So, Hart explains that's why he will be expelled from school, solving the problem. However, he starts complaining that he doesn't want to be his clone. Then, Hart promises to create a magical barrier to protect him. They decide to make a deal. Later, Charlotte and Flay visit Hart in his relaxation room to watch anime. Later, Charlotte tells him that it's exhausting to visit him from the castle, so he invents a teleportation door to make it easier. Subsequently, he asks his clone to try it, but he refuses. As a result, Flay gets angry and goes through the door to reach the clone, whom she pulls into Hart's room. In this way, they check that it works. In the following days, Charlotte continues to watch anime in Hart's room, who decides to look for an assistant. He leaves the room without saying anything. This way, he encounters the skeletons he defeated a few years ago. Then, he claims to have given them some land since they didn't stop following him after the incident. In addition, he realizes that they have built many things. Subsequently, Johnny, the village commander, explains that he has gathered other monsters without homes. He also invites him to visit their crops, where he shows the vegetables they have grown to accommodate more monsters, as they cannot eat them. Next, Johnny shows Hart the entire territory, and he is impressed by everything they have achieved. Moreover, he thinks that Johnny would make a good assistant if he gave him skin. However, seeing that he doesn't stop talking, he affirms that he would probably drive him crazy. Therefore, he bids him farewell and continues his way. Later, he sits alone until the giant golem sits beside him and gives him a flower, to which Hart states that it would be a good assistant if it weren't so big. Saying that, he returns to his room where Flay asks him about the assistant he mentioned before leaving. However, he remembers that Gold told him he couldn't take Flay. Therefore, he replies that it's none of her business. The next day, Charlotte tells Hart that she has thought of another name for the Dark Knight, so he sends her to Johnny to name his lands. While there, she claims that the name will be Demon's Garden. On the other hand, a group of hunters finds a blizzard dragon, which tries to escape but ends up injured due to the snowstorm. Later, Gold informs Hart that the dragon is near the border, so he asks Flay to investigate. However, she refuses, stating that she only obeys Hart's orders. Then, Charlotte stops them and asks Flay to save the dragon, to which she agrees. Therefore, Hart and Flay find the dragon, but they realize that the hunters intend to attack it, so they approach them. Meanwhile, they attack the dragon, but Hart stops them. Next, he heals the dragon's wounds while Flay loses control and attacks the hunters. When it's over, Hart tries to talk to the dragon, but it ignores him and asks Flay why she obeys a human. After that, she tells her story. As a result, the dragon understands the situation and reveals that it doesn't like to fight. That's why it has been hiding in its cave for 300 years until an adventurer forgot his book there. Then, it started reading it repeatedly. However, wanting to read more, it decided to go to a city where it transformed into a human to enter the library. However, after a few days, adventurers found her and began attacking her. Saying this, Flay starts crying, while Hart invites the dragon to join them. After that, the dragon transforms into a human. So, Hart puts clothes on her and makes a pact with her. Also, he names her Lisa, causing Flay to become jealous. Back at the castle, Hart introduces Lisa and tells Gold that she wants to work as a maid. As a result, he accepts, stating that she must follow the rules. The next day, Flay takes Lisa to the courtyard where she tells her that her first task will be to sweep. Therefore, she starts gathering all the leaves until she finishes. Next, Flay takes her to the kitchen where she assigns her the task of washing the dishes. Later, Lisa washes them carefully while Flay ends up breaking them. Therefore, she tries to teach her to cook, but she ends up burning the food. On the other hand, Lisa prepares a very tasty meal that impresses the other maids but makes Flay jealous. At dinner, Gold is amazed when he tastes her food. Also, Natalia congratulates her on her work and asks what else she can do, to which Lisa replies that by reading many books, she learned to control magic. Saying this, Natalia asks her to be Charlotte's personal maid. The next day, Lisa wakes up Charlotte and dresses her to start the day. Later, she takes her to the courtyard where she teaches her to control her magical element. Then, they both start studying in the library until it's bath time. Later, Charlotte tells Hart that her magic has increased thanks to Lisa. Then, he realizes that while Lisa teaches Charlotte, she also does the laundry. So, he asks her if she feels married, to which she replies that no because she loves to move around. Next, Charlotte and Lisa promise to be friends. Seeing all this, Hart realizes that Lisa will be the ideal assistant for him. However, he stops thinking that he won't be able to separate her from Charlotte. Then, he comes up with the idea of using his teleportation door to take her to the capital until he gets expelled from school. After a few weeks, Charlotte visits Hart in his room and finishes watching a series. Therefore, Charlotte tells him that his break is over, so they decide to return to the castle. Then, Hart tells them that in a week, he will go to school. Upon hearing this, Charlotte orders Lisa to gather her friends for an important meeting. As a result, Flay, Johnny, and the Golem gather with her. After that, Charlotte tells them about Hart and his decision to go to school, surprising Flay, who complains about not having known earlier. Next, Charlotte tells them that Hart himself confessed to her that school is a scary place. Therefore, she thinks his plan is to go to school to defeat the student council, which surely hurts other students. Saying this, Charlotte comments that for that reason, she will go to the capital with Flay and Lisa to investigate. As a result, everyone agrees. At night, Lisa tells everything to Hart, who thanks her and asks her to be his assistant. In response, she accepts, stating that she will do whatever he asks. The next day, the maids complain to Flay about their relationship problems, to which she advises them to end the relationship. Later, Charlotte asks her why she's wearing a different uniform than the others. Flay explains that the other uniforms didn't cover her chest, so they made one that fits her. Subsequently, Charlotte asks her to teach her to fly like Lisa, and Flay starts pretending to fly by jumping. Just then, Natalia approaches and tells Charlotte that she's still too young to use that kind of magic. However, Flay asks Hart for help, and he provides them with a small plane for Charlotte to fly. Later, Charlotte invites Flay to take a bath, and Flay decides to go to a river where she bathes alone. Later, they encounter Lisa. Hart asks her how she used to live in her old cave. Lisa explains that she spent most of her time sleeping and, when awake, reading her books. This impresses Hart, who envies her for having had an ideal life. The next day, Lisa is amazed to see the teleportation door created by Hart. At night, the girls decide to take a hot water bath. However, Flay refuses, stating that her species only bathes in cold water. However, Lisa convinces her and she jumps into the water. 3 days later, Hart makes a device to calculate mana and he uses it on the girls. He notices that Charlotte's mana is high. She explains that when she was a baby, she created a fireball, but Natalia cast a spell to hide her magic. When the day arrives, Hart says goodbye to Gold and Natalia. He hides Lisa's tail and horns so she won't be discovered, while Flay feels betrayed for not going with him. On the other hand, Marion informs Laius that Hart will study in the capital with them. Laius seems indifferent but expresses a desire to learn more from him since he's been training to improve since their last encounter. He mocks Marion for being so happy to see Hart, and she inadvertently admits that she doesn't feel anything for him. Next, Laius changes the subject and reveals that a satanic sect is trying to control the school, and the kingdom is also in danger because this sect has collected money from other people. Laius confesses that his mother, Consort, is behind all of it, and her behavior has worsened since she got the collar. Marion suggests that Hart could help solve everything since he has incredible power. Consort suddenly appears and starts choking Marion, telling her to stop looking at her collar. She then releases her and approaches Laius, asking him to befriend Hart at school and inquire about the Dark Knight. Laius agrees to do so. Later, Charlotte reminds Hart that it's time to go to the capital. Meanwhile, Flay begs him to take her, but he refuses and goes with Lisa using the teleportation door. They appear in the middle of a forest near the capital. Lisa points out that a bison is chasing a group of people. Hart puts on his suit and decides to save them. He uses his barriers to rescue a child and then heals the wounds of a girl. The girl tells the others to flee while she faces the bison. Hart hits it and heals the girl's injuries, who is surprised by his healing magic. Later, he repairs their cart, and the girl promises to reward him the next time they meet. Hart decides to take the bison back to its herd and says goodbye to the girl. Subsequently, Lisa feeds the bison. Both continue their journey to the capital, and Lisa can't stop thinking about the strange girl she met, saying she looked very peculiar. Upon arriving at school, Hart states that he wants to leave. However, he decides to enter and fill out a large stack of papers. Then, he enters the classrooms, uses his magic to return home, and lies on the couch, claiming he's very tired and hungry. After this, Charlotte encourages them to eat in the capital. Therefore, he makes Flay's ears and tail invisible so they won't be discovered. Thus, they return to the capital and decide to enter a restaurant and eat. Later, Charlotte takes out a map and says they should split up to explore the area. Thus, she and Hart decide to go together. Consequently, they stroll through the city until they reach a necklace store, where Hart buys one for Charlotte. Later, she starts running and ends up bumping into the peculiar girl, who apologizes and mentions that she's in a hurry for a job interview. The next day, Hart's clone tells him that someone entered his room and announced that he must take an exam before the school's entrance ceremony. Hart comes up with the idea of deliberately failing to get expelled. Therefore, he enters the school, where he meets a teacher named Palkos, who takes him to the classroom and hands him the exam. Afterward, Hart writes incorrect answers until he decides to write some correct ones. Upon finishing, Palkos takes his exam and brings him to another teacher for a mana test. Next, she observes him and introduces herself as Terrietta. Then, Palkos hands her Hart's exam. Seeing it, she decides to proceed with the test. She places a Mija sphere in front of him to measure his power. Consequently, he concentrates his power and ends up breaking it. Terrietta realizes that he actually has a lot of power. She also finds his correct answers interesting and decides to be his teacher. However, Hart refuses and decides to leave. Back in his room, he asks his clone to attend school for him. The next day, he sends the clone with Charlotte a weapon so she can defend herself. The clone confesses that, despite sharing memories with Hart, it can't use magic. Later, classes end, and he tries to return to his room. However, he ends up colliding with the chest of the peculiar girl named Irisfilia. After this, the school vice president, named Schneider, approaches them and tells them to kneel before him for not greeting him. However, the clone tries to escape, claiming to have a stomachache. Then, Schneider gets angry and attacks him using magic. As a result, he falls to the ground, but he gets up as if nothing happened, thanks to the barrier that Hart placed on him. Subsequently, Irisfilia approaches him and apologizes for involving him in that. After this, Schneider gets angry and tries to attack him violently. However, the clone uses his weapon and shoots a beam of light, managing to escape. Back in his room, Hart visits him and lets him return to his home to rest. Later, one of Schneider's maids visits Hart and delivers a letter inviting him to fight against Schneider. However, Hart tries to refuse, but the girl tells him that if he doesn't accept, it will be a shame for his father. Back in his room, he sees Irisfilia entering Schneider's house. Subsequently, she asks him to cancel the fight. However, Schneider tells her that he won't. So Irisfilia keeps insisting until he tells her that if she dances naked for him, he will accept not to fight. As a result, Irisfilia starts undressing. Seeing this, Hart becomes impatient and stops her using his hero suit. Then, he faces Schneider, who attacks him upon seeing him. In response, Hart injures him in the shoulder and makes a hole. After this, Schneider starts complaining about the pain, while Hart explains that he will have to cancel the fight because the wound won't heal for a long time. After finishing with him, his companions try to heal him, but they only cause him more pain. The next day, the teachers corner Hart and praise him for defeating Laius. Then, he moves away from them to go to his room. Then, he hears other students talking about him, claiming that he defeated Schneider in one blow. Subsequently, Terrietta takes him by the hand and asks him to be part of her research. However, he refuses, but she keeps insisting. Then, she shows him her courses. First, she teaches him that he can choose sword training to become a real knight, or the second course, which involves being locked in a magical laboratory to learn ancient magic. In response, Hart refuses, while Terrietta asks him to give her his signature to start. Later, Laius tries to greet Hart, but he puts him in a hole for not recognizing him. After this, Marion approaches, so Hart gets to know them and realizes that Laius has become quite assertive. Consequently, Marion asks Hart to join her research. However, Laius complains alongside Terrietta, who claims she will do everything possible for Hart to join her. Next, Laius tells Hart not to join her because her results are very poor. This upsets Terrietta, who explains that people without intelligence can't understand her. Finally, they try to convince Hart to join them. But just then, Irisfilia appears and says she wants to talk to Hart, so he takes her hand and goes with her. After this, Hart asks her what she wants to talk about. Then, Irisfilia tells him that she has noticed something strange about him. The day before, she couldn't see his mana, but now she sees a force in him that is superior. Consequently, Hart begins to think that Irisfilia is a demon. However, she tells him she is human, and he responds that he can't give her much information about himself. That said, Irisfilia asks him to be her friend, and he decides to accept unintentionally. Then, she explains that she has never had friends. She tells him that her parents abandoned her 4 times, and years later, she was adopted in a monastery, where the only one who treated her well was a monk who died when she was 5 years old, so she never learned to socialize or have friends. After this, Hart confesses that he hasn't had friends either, as he has always kept himself locked in his room. Subsequently, Irisfilia tells him that she will be in Terrietta's course, so he decides to accompany her, affirming that friends should support each other. On the other hand, Charlotte and the girls take a bath in the pool. She complains of being bored because of Hart, who no longer plays with her because he is in school. Flay also complains, saying she wants to be with Hart. Subsequently, Charlotte claims to have had a vision as an excuse to visit Hart. Later, Flay tells Lisa about her previous life working alongside the Dark Lord. Then, she explains that the Dark Lord wanted to unite humans with demons to live in peace, and that's why she let herself be defeated by Princess Consort to reincarnate as a human. She also says she's glad to have found Hart to continue serving him. After this, Lisa asks her what the Dark Lord's previous name was, and she tells her it was Irisfilia. At this point, time goes back to the moment when Irisfilia introduces herself to Hart. Subsequently, she invites him to fill out the papers to enter Terrietta's course, so he invites her to his room. Upon entering, they find Charlotte, who starts petting Hart, saying she will be his second wife, which bothers Irisfilia, who introduces herself to her. Subsequently, Hart and she sit down to fill out the papers until he gets tired and asks Charlotte to write for him. Finally, she tells Irisfilia that Hart doesn't really need to study because he has surpassed all the necessary knowledge, surprising her as she begins to think that Hart is impressive. Then, Charlotte returns to the castle, so Hart covers Irisfilia's eyes so she won't see his magic door. The next day, Charlotte wakes up Hart to go to classes. She also hands him the sheet of his activities. Then, he realizes that Charlotte has chosen the most advanced classes for him. Later, he has the brilliant idea of taking advantage of the opportunity to get bad grades and disappoint the teachers who trust him. With that said, Charlotte hugs him as a farewell. Already at school, Hart introduces Lisa to Irisfilia. Then, Hart informs her that he has been placed in Class C due to his abilities, to which she encourages him to get good grades in the next exam so that he can be with her in Class A. Subsequently, Lisa mentions to Hart that Irisfilia gives the impression of being more than human. Later, he enters his Class C, where the teacher explains to everyone that they must take an exam that will lead them to a higher or lower class. Starting, Hart realizes that the exam questions are too easy even for Charlotte, so he decides to answer most of them not to look bad. Upon finishing, the teacher is disappointed with the majority, stating that the average score was 20. Then, he congratulates Hart for scoring 60 points, to which he becomes depressed, affirming that it was not his intention. As a result, the teacher sends him to Class A, where Hart meets Laius and Philia, who hold him and take him to the seats. Consequently, the oratory teacher introduces herself to everyone to start the class. In addition, she scolds them for talking. Next, she asks Philia to place her hands on a magical sphere to see her power and elements. As a result, she realizes that Philia controls all the elements, so she invites her to join her course, but she refuses. Therefore, oratory asks Laius how to increase element control with a magic spell, to which Hart unintentionally decides to answer. Then, oratory is surprised to hear him, stating that those questions are so difficult that only a mysterious man named Wybe has given them the answers. Therefore, she invites Hart to her course, but he rejects her. Later, Terrietta and Palkos welcome Hart and Philia to their laboratory. Then, Hart confesses that his original self is still sleeping, so he tries to leave until Terrietta shows them Schneider. In addition, she explains that he came seeking help because he has a very strange wound on his shoulder. Later, Philia sees it and realizes that someone has used non-elemental magic against him. Then, she begins to say that the culprit is someone capable of controlling ancient magic effortlessly. Subsequently, she slaps Schneider and asks him who did that to him. He answers that it was a man dressed in black. After this, Terrietta approaches Hart's clone and blames him for what happened, stating that he was probably the cause. After this, Hart appears with his Dark Knight suit and promises Schneider to remove his wound if he decides to cancel the fight, to which he accepts. With that said, Hart tries to leave, but he realizes that Terrietta has him trapped. However, he frees himself with his power and immobilizes her, who says she needs to pee. However, Hart punishes her until she apologizes. Later, Palkos and Terrietta throw a party for Hart and Philia. Being there, Palkos tells Hart that since she was a child, Terrietta has been very curious and intelligent, so much so that her knowledge surpassed his when he was her teacher. With that said, Philia approaches Hart, who realizes that she is already drunk. However, he keeps drinking until she falls asleep on his lap. Subsequently, Terrietta tells Hart that Philia is unique, being able to control all the elements. However, she tells him that her mana is scarce, although with ancient magic, it may improve. With that said, Terrietta falls asleep from alcohol, so Hart decides to accompany them. On the other hand, Schneider gets angry thinking that all his friends will see him as a coward if he cancels the fight, so he hires a group of assassins to attack Hart. Therefore, the assassins prepare to attack. Next, the captain tries to enter the school but hits a barrier that covers the entire school. After this, a door appears in the middle, so one of the assassins enters and is caught by Hart. Subsequently, many doors begin to appear, which swallow the assassins until the captain uses his magic to guess which one Hart is in. Then, he believes he has found him and attacks him with a fireball. Next, more Dark Knights appear from the doors, and the captain realizes that they are actually his fellow assassins in disguise. After this, Hart immobilizes him and takes him with his companions to Schneider's room. Seeing this, he denies having hired them. However, Hart shows him the moment he did and tells him that he will punish him for not obeying. Consequently, Schneider takes a syringe and injects his arm. As a result, he transforms into a giant monster and hits Hart. Next, Charlotte calls him, so Hart tells her what is happening, and she asks him to save Schneider. Later, Hart avoids his blows and hits him in the chest without getting any results. After this, Schneider crushes him with his hands, so Hart uses his barriers to immobilize his arms. But then, he cuts off his arms and regenerates them quickly. After this, Charlotte calls Hart and tells him to try cutting the larger parts of Schneider. Then, he summons 1,000 magical swords and throws them at him until he cuts him into pieces. As a result, Schneider returns to normal, so Hart tries to talk to him, but he runs away because he has no clothes. Later, Hart's clone wakes up and talks to him. Then, Hart states that his new life is better than before, as he has found friends and things to do instead of being locked up. The next day, Flay and Lisa go to the capital, where they try to get information from an elderly man who can't hear them. Subsequently, some guys invite them to an alley, but then Flay hits them until they tell her everything. Later, both of them meet with Charlotte and Johnny and tell her that Consort and the king are having a dispute, putting the capital in danger. With that said, Charlotte shows them the recording of Hart's fight and plans to enter the school to gather information about the sect trying to destroy the capital. Upon seeing this, Heart states that he will have to help them so that no one harms them, even if it means not being able to rest as he wants. And that's how the first season of this anime ends. If you've reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you've been one of the few people to make it this far. So comment the word magic in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.